Terrific. Well, Steve Krakauer, who journalist, media critic, podcaster, producer of the Megyn Kelly Show, which is awesome. Welcome to our leadership series, where we've been trying to dive into topics of high relevance in politics and policy, and particularly looking up for new authors who've written interesting books. And you're one, so good to have you here.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
I really enjoy actually I really enjoy your Fourth Watch newsletter, which I don't know why I stumbled upon during the pandemic. But what I love about it in part is, I'm a voracious reader. I get tons of media, all the traditional stuff, although I don't really watch a lot of TV. But you do a really nice job of offering alternative angles or sort of backstories that often help me get a little more nuance. I mean, it's not crazy town. It's not Bill Gates created COVID pandemic, whatever, but it's often highlighting things about the media in a way that I feel like expands my understanding. So for everybody who's here, besides the fact that we bought copies of Uncovered, which we'll be talking about for our attendees, and as always, we'll send out a link to get mailed. Check out the Fourth Watch newsletter. I think it's on Substack, which Steve creates. But let's dive in. Let's start with you and kind of the background. You were a journalist, and for many years you were pretty mainstream. I mean, CNN among others. I'm interested. How'd you first get into journalism? Is this something you always wanted to do? And if you would kind of talk your career path from then till now, please.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I kind of was a journalism nerd going way back. My first job, actually, I was my first job ever. It was the summer after my sophomore year in high school. I went to my local town paper. I grew up in Westfield, New Jersey, which is in central Jersey, this little town my parents grew up in as well. And I walked into the little town newspaper and said, I'd love to have an internship. I'll work for free. They said, we have these men's summer league softball games that happen during the summer. You can go there, take pictures, and if we use one of your pictures, we'll pay you $20. And I was like, all right, sounds good. And so that's kind of what started. And then I would write recaps of them, and that ended up actually worked there over the summer 4 or 5 years. Ended up starting an internship program there, writing columns, wrote front page stories for them. Became really obsessed with it. I went to summer camp at Northwestern University for high school students the summer before my senior year in high school. Was a journalism major, broadcast journalism at Syracuse University in Newhouse, where I went. I also had a column for 3 years in the student newspaper there, the Daily Orange. And so yeah, I knew very early on that was what I was interested in. As you mentioned, was at CNN. Before CNN, I worked at NBC. It was an NBC page. I was at Fox News. I also was the original TV editor and then later the senior editor of a site called Mediaite, which is now, I just got an email actually just before starting. It was a 15-year anniversary of Mediaite starting this summer. That was my one of my first jobs. I was at TV Newser as well, covering the industry. And then, yeah, I moved over to CNN in 2010 when Piers Morgan started a show there at CNN. And I kind of knew that I wanted to go from covering the media to really getting my hands into it. And Piers, I thought, was this really fascinating guy. I knew him from Celebrity Apprentice, which it's kind of interesting how everything has gone since the Celebrity Apprentice days. When Piers won the first season of Celebrity Apprentice, obviously Donald Trump was the host and producer of that. And I also knew him. He had this incredible interview style. And so, yeah, I went and as a Mediaite editor, sat down, I had coffee with him for like off the record. And I pitched him in that meeting on what I could do for his show, which at the time was, there was not a lot of social media being used back in, 2009. I mean, it existed, but wasn't really part of it. I said, you're going to do an hour on CNN. What happens the other 23 hours? We need a website for you. We need extra content for the website. We need social media. We need to get you on something called Twitter. And he kind of bought into it. I moved over to CNN, worked with him, and then I ended up doing, basically I was the senior digital producer. I reported into television, but oversaw all of what television looked like on digital at CNN for the 2012 election. Was in all of the meetings for the 2012 election there, and was there until 2013. I moved over to the Blaze, Glenn Beck's company. That's what brought me down to Texas, where I still live in Dallas, Texas. I worked with Glenn Beck as a VP of digital content for his company at the Blaze, and then kind of got all out of the media completely. I was working at a marketing agency for a while, started the Fourth Watch newsletter, and then got connected with Megan during the pandemic, Megan Kelly, and we launched the Megan Kelly Show in August 2020, and I got right back into it. So yeah, that's kind of the path to where I am now.
Okay, so that I love, by the way, I love starting as a high school or even middle school kid taking pictures of men's softball, but I love the commitment. So given that path, one presumes that you love media. You're very bought in. CNN is cool, Pierce Morgan is cool, um, but given the nature of the book and frankly the nature of Fourth Watch, something happened, whether it was on
Yeah.
the road to Damascus or you red pilled, or like, what is it that led you to suddenly conclude the media that I've been part of is not the media that should be, and that I'm going to now spend my time trying to unmask the failings of the media that I used to be very desperate to get into the middle of?
Absolutely. Yeah, it really did. And I say this with the book, with Uncovered, and, I write this in the book, and really with Fourth Watch as well, which I started in 2019. I'm not someone who is a media hater. I don't want to tear down the establishment and just start fresh. Uh, I believe that America, like, we are helped if we have a strong institutional media that's well funded and people trust it. That's the goal. And so it pains me to see what happened, particularly with CNN, where I honestly, like, 90 to 95% of my time at CNN, and I was there 2010 to 2013. I loved my time there. I love the people I work with. Many of those people are still there. And I do think that one of the things that bugs me so much is that every day there's good journalism that happens at CNN. There's good journalism that happens at the New York Times, but it so often gets lost in the mix because of so many other factors. And I think that that's what really I started to see when I moved to Texas in 2013. I kind of started to look at it as an outside observer. The two big things that I can point to are the rise of social media, which obviously I was very much a part of, and bring that in. But I think that as soon as journalists started to see that they were not just about, there was this path outside of being a, this anonymous, I'm just a reporter at my news organization, the LA Times, the New York Times. No, they could be a personality. They could be an influencer. They could grow an audience. They could get feedback. In the old days, they used to, if someone sent a letter to the newsroom, you had to read the letter, or even an email, an instant email. But then all of a sudden, as soon as you could get criticism and honestly praise, and we can talk more about this, as soon as that could happen publicly, what 5 people, 10 people say starts to change the incentive, starts to change the way the media works. So that really happened. And I think that kind of can trace to 2013, 2014 with the rise of social media and its influence on the press. And then obviously, like, the elephant in the room is Donald Trump. I mean, I think that it wasn't even right away. I mean, 2015, you look at some of the coverage of Trump in the primaries, 2015 at CNN, at Morning Joe. I mean, it was night and day, but I think that, and I know for a fact, I mean, I've talked to a lot of the people that are still at these news organizations that I consider friends. Uh, the shock of him winning in November 2016 changed people. And I actually, I tell this story a little bit in the book, but in 2017, I kind of, I'm living in Dallas, I'm working at a marketing agency, but I see what happened, and I see that these large media organizations missed what happened so much. And I was surprised, but I wasn't shocked. I knew people I had friends here in Dallas, people that are left-leaning, people that are gay and married, who are Trump supporters, who are Trump voters in 2016. It wasn't shocking to me, but I think they missed it. And so I called in all my favors. I wrote up this proposal, and I had meetings with people like Jeff Zucker and the head of CBS News and the head of ABC News. And I said, clearly you've got some blind spots here. And I think they acknowledged it at first. But very quickly it turned into this antagonistic relationship with Trump, and I think he fed into it. And suddenly all of the worst habits were exacerbated. It was just like this, it was just this rush. And I've said this again to many people that I have talked to as recently as a year ago. It if you want to say that Donald Trump is an existential threat to democracy and he's the worst thing, and we have to save democracy, and that's what you really feel. I don't necessarily believe that, if that's what you believe, that's when you need to double down on your principles. That's when, okay, you need two sources to put something on the air. Now you need three. Now you need four. Really make people trust you. That's the only way to do this. But we saw it go the other direction. And as I documented and uncovered, suddenly what the guardrails were off, and that's what really bothered me about it. It's not it has I'm not a particularly political person. I don't really care one way or the other. I've never voted for Donald Trump. I don't really feel that strongly about him politically, but I know the way he can turn people into essentially making their worst mistakes. And I think that's what happened. And it bothers me to this day to see the polls come out every year after year, the trust that the people of of America, not political people, people who are apolitical, independents, have less and less trust in the media, and it bothers me. And I hope it changes. It's what I try to help is make it better.
Well, first you hit all of these topics in the great book, and you just hit like 800 buzz topics at the same time, and it's almost I've got questions and go in every one of these directions. Although, maybe start with the influencer effect that is derivative of social media that you were describing. How much of that do you find is consistent, not just with TV where it would make sense, but also with print? Um, did it because I feel like the Trump phenomenon very much you could see in a lot of the print organizations, but the influencer effect feels intuitively like it might have been a little more of a social media thing, although a lot of the print people were on the non-video social media. So is it just that these all kind of were trending in the same direction at the same time?
Yeah, and I really think that I would be able to write, in Uncovered, I lay out four big problems with the modern media. I would say, I'm sorry, five big problems. I think four of them would exist anyway if it weren't for Donald Trump. If he never existed, if he decided to just stay the host on NBC, we still would have some really clear problems with the press because of a lot of factors. I mean, just the idea of uh, the the way people consume their news, or the way people consume media. You used to sit down and you turn on your television and you click around to different channels. That obviously is changing in a massive way. You used to get a newspaper sent to your house, then you go online, then you don't really go to the website. You kind of just get whatever your feed looks like. I mean, all of these things would have existed anyway without Trump. And I think the social media thing is absolutely a very real one as well. And like I see it myself. If you buy into what the people who love you on Twitter or now X say about you, or the people that hate you. They are such a non-reflective, you know, like case study or non-reflective group of people that the problem is that people start to buy into it, and I think that you start to see adjustments based on it. In my book Uncovered, I interviewed 26 people all throughout the media, people from Tucker Carlson and people that are at Fox News currently, people that are at MSNBC like Ali Velshi, who remains a good friend of mine, but also CEOs, people like Sharon Waxman, who owns a company called The Wrap, which I think is a great website. I've known Sharon for a while. She's like a real capital J journalist, New York Times, LA Times. Now she runs The Wrap. And Sharon told me she has watched her own reporters make decisions on how they cover a story or potentially not to cover a story at all because of what she describes as the chilling effect of what might happen to them, but because of what people say on social media. I mean, that's a huge problem. And that's a new phenomenon. That is something that simply did not exist even 10 years ago. There was no real mechanism for that kind of feedback and that kind of public situation to happen either. So yeah, I think that social media is probably the most pervasive one. And it's one that is frankly getting worse, but for the fact that I do think people are aware of it in a way that they weren't maybe a few years back.
So again, as I noted, we've got copies, all of you guys, but I'll fess up. I didn't actually read this book. I bought this book after listening to it on Audible. And while we need to unload the copies we've bought now because we already paid for them, I would recommend for anybody else who loves Audible, you have a lot of those third parties give their testimonials. So it kind of has a almost an NPR-y feel if you lose the political spin, which I really enjoyed. I
Thank you.
enjoyed that you would you'd cut to live audio clips of a lot of the folks that had a kind of a raw, different than your typical, super overproduced Audible book. So just a quick plug for those of you who are listening. You may want to consider Audible, even though this one's already paid for you.
Yeah, no, I have to say this is my first book. Never written a book before. And I had this idea from literally the proposal I wrote included the idea of wanting to do an audiobook where I recorded both video and audio of all the conversations I had. Everyone's on the record. There are no anonymous quotes in the book, which is another reason that I think that the media has gotten so far off track is the over reliance on anonymous sources. And I really pitched it. I mean, I understand a lot of production went into it. It was not my doing. But yeah, it was to hear the people. It's one thing for me to read what Tucker Carlson told me about the way he realized that he had to get out of DC, but it's another to hear him say it, to tell the actual story. And so, yes, it's about 30 to 35% of the audiobook and the book are other people and kind
No,
of firsthand.
I enjoyed it, although I think Tucker's voice is squeakily annoying. Um, so one of the things you talk about in the book, you make a really strong case that a lot of what you write up as bias is a reflection of who works in the media. Where they live, where they went to school, who they're around all the time. Could you talk more about the nature of the coastal mainstream media creating an ideological monoculture? So some of perhaps the bias is actually just a blindness due to lack of diversity.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that there is what I would describe and is the first problem that I lay out in the book, a geographic bias. And certainly that the, quote unquote mainstream media has a political bias, although I would almost say there are people that are in these newsrooms. Like when I worked at CNN, I would imagine most people that voted that I encountered, and I knew some. I mean, a lot of people didn't vote. A lot of people would kind of really feel like I need to suppress my own personal political opinions, but most of them lean left. Some of them don't. Some of them vote Republican. But there is a general sameness when it comes to culture, when it comes to point of view, and that even extends to people that have left their home. I mean, I talked to someone like Will Kane, who is now a fellow Texan like myself. He's at Fox now, was at ESPN, but was at CNN before that also, actually, back when I was there. And he and I both say the same thing in the sense of like you find people that leave where they're from, go to New York, go to DC, and start these jobs, whether it's in government, whether it's in media, and they're doing that for a reason. They're kind of they want to leave their home, and it's not necessarily that they vote a certain way. It's not really about politics. It's more so about culture. And I talk to reporters like from the New York Times or Selena Zito who say, go around the newsroom, ask how many people are pro-life for one, who own a gun or who know how to fire a gun and who know how to load a gun. And then I have to say, I'm a Yankee, myself. I grew up in New Jersey, school in Syracuse. I've been in Texas for 10 years. This is all new to me, but it was enlightening to me. I mean, it's you learn that people have messy points of views culturally, who are not just, a lot of hardcore Hillary supporters that I knew in 2016 go to the gun range every week. It's not so cut and dry. And so yeah, I think that what I reflected on, probably the biggest thing when I really left CNN and I really stepped back and I started to see what happened, it was that there was a general sameness in culture more than in politics. And that's what led to not only just bias, but mistakes. But just, and God, I mean, we could spend 5 hours talking about the pandemic, but COVID really exacerbated this also. And just one quick story on it. So I write about this on Uncovered, where I was watching Meet the Press one day, and this was like in the height of the pandemic. We're talking like, I guess it was maybe October of 2020. And at the time I had a 4-year-old in kindergarten, and there's a graphic that flashes up on the screen, and it's states where masks are banned in schools. And Texas was one of them, and I'm like, wait a second. I mean, first of all, Dallas ISD, where my son goes to public school, actually defied the mandate from the governor, and masks were required in all Dallas schools of all children and of all ages. But even besides that, there was never masks were banned. Masks were not banned. Mask mandates were banned. And so even after the mask mandates were no longer banned, there's still 75, 80% of the kids wore masks. So, but you look at that graphic and you think, well, if you're just a normal viewer and you're trying to understand what's happening in the rest of the country in places that I don't live in and I've never been to, maybe, you have this perception of the way things are. And I think that led to a lot of the problems that we saw with the COVID coverage for years.
Great point. So in your subtitle, you leave no doubt about the thesis: how the media got cozy with power, abandoned its principles, and lost the people. It led to a whole bunch of follow-ups that I wanted to ask. So first, do you feel like that is as true of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal as you make clear is true of CNN and MSNBC?
Uh, Yes and no. I think that they're in, if you look at geographic bias, uh, there, I lay out this scenario where, and I've done a walk similar to this, but in New York City, I could go and I could walk to the corporate headquarters of CBS News, ABC News, CNN, NBC News, but I could also keep going and walk to Fox News. I mean, Fox News is literally across the street from NBC News. The Wall Street Journal is right there in that same building. So yes, I do think like if we expand it out to corporate media, there is a conservative leaning or right leaning corporate media that is absolutely an element of this as well. And I don't spend a lot of time in the book. I actually, in the second to last chapter, I kind of say, well, what if I'm wrong? Because I talked to this former executive who told me, you're missing the story. The story is about Fox News. It's about the control that they have on half the country. Okay, sure, there's some mistakes going on. And I think that that's valid. And I think that there have been many books by my friend and someone I disagree with very much, Brian Stelter is one of them. Where I think that there are actual dynamics about this as well. And I do think that this is part of the reason why independent media, both on the left and right, has really started to thrive in recent years. From the Joe Rogans of the world, Megyn Kelly obviously is one of them right at the forefront. So yeah, I think that people are on both sides are feeling underserved by the places that they used to just feel more comfortable going to.
All right, so another follow-up, the media got cozy with power, and I'm a history nerd. The first thing I thought of is, well, the media didn't cover FDR being in a wheelchair or having a girlfriend, and JFK had a veritable Praetorian guard of media who protected him from stuff that Bill Clinton was less protected from. Um, what's new about the media getting cozy with political leaders? Feels like that's always been true.
I think that's fair. It's one of the things that I kind of wrestled with a little bit because in some ways the coziness with power is something that's existed, as you mentioned, for decades, going back, centuries. The problem is twofold. First, there is now I think that the incentive structure has changed, and I lay out examples like Harvey Weinstein, which with what happened at NBC News, with
Yeah.
Jeffrey Epstein, and some of what we've seen more recently there. You're going to get a general kind of like uh, basically that social media in some ways. I'm sorry to kind of go into the nuance of it, but I think like we there are positives to social media and there are negatives, clearly. And one of the positives of it is that we're able to see things more clearly and more fully. And the gatekeepers are no longer there. So I think part of the problem is why it's become more pervasive here is that the coziness with power is more visible. We're more able to see it. And when we're more able to see it, that would require a bigger adjustment by the people that are covering these people, the powerful people. But instead, we've kind of gone the other direction in some instances. I mean, I praise some of the coverage of the Trump administration in the book because I think for the first time, many journalists discovered the idea of having an antagonistic relationship with those in political power, and in a lot of ways, I think that's a good thing. The problem is, when they focus on certain areas and they make mistakes because of other sort of biases that come up. But that's what you want. You want that kind of that sort of antagonism. They shouldn't be friends. It should be this constant conflict in a way. I mean, not literal conflict, but it should be a little bit of it. So I think that part of the problem that the part of the reason that the coziness with power has become so much more obvious and so much more glaring is because of what people know and because of what we're able to see now and get exposed, frankly, thanks to independent sources that are now kind of shining a light on it that they weren't before.
I think that's fair. And look, I mean, there are plenty of people, even at very mainstream, generally Trump hostile places, like Maggie Haberman, who's she gets there must be some relationship. She's known Trump for a long time, but she is hardly his friend. She is a hard hitter. The only thing that I thought she couldn't get any tougher, and then she brought Swan on board, and I'm like, all right, this is like Batman and Robin.
Swan's
Um,
great. Jonathan Swan is great.
He's
Yeah.
great. And what's interesting is the story in Politico today about how the Biden White House is very much at war with the New York Times because they feel like the New York Times is supposed to be on their side and that they're being too tough.
I know it's incredible. And by the way, to his credit, Jonathan Swan, I saw as someone who criticizes X or Twitter constantly, I spend way too much time on there. Jonathan Swan, who's not he does not put himself out there in a way this very often, but really so that was not his experience, that it was not getting like from the publisher that we should be harder on the Bidens until President Biden gives us an interview. So that's absolutely not the case. Look, I think that it's the Obama administration was felt this way, that they got a sore deal from the press. I mean, it's kind of incredible to look at back at it. And frankly, I mean, I lay out in the very excuse me, first chapter of the book, the way that the Obama administration had a really clamp down. I mean, they used the Espionage Act. We hear a lot about the Espionage Act. They used the Espionage Act to crack down on journalists and their sources in ways that was unprecedented, more times than any other administration combined. And since kind of set the table for it. Another New York Times journalist wrote a column as soon as Donald Trump got into power that said, if Donald Trump targets journalists, blame Obama. And so anyway, but I think what's interesting is that, the Obama administration, the Biden administration are all think they're getting a bad deal from the press. And it's just kind of, I guess, goes with the territory.
Right. Look, I got to serve, albeit in a distant location, in the George W. Bush administration. The media is hostile to every Republican, and while the Republicans think they're nice to Democrats, I bet it doesn't feel that way when you're a communications director for the Democrats.
Right.
So, I want to turn to something else. You do a really good job talking about the sort of the geographical and educational and many ways in which the similarity of so many of the people in the national news creates to a similarity of worldview and thereby a similarity of coverage, which I get that. That makes sense. You talk about social media, you talk about the Trump effect, which then the even bigger wave of COVID comes along and it all triples down. But to me, one of the biggest things, and I think Steyerwalt in Broken News does a really good job of highlighting this too, is we're also in an era of a different business model.
Yeah.
The reason it leads if it bleeds is because these guys, Cronkite had two competitors. These guys have infinite competitors. When, you and Megan can put on a totally kick-ass show that doesn't require a cable bundle package, doesn't require a foreign correspondence desk. I mean, there is so much competition. And I think a huge amount of what I perceive is, whether it's Fox, and Ailes in the day being in the tank for the Republicans, or MSNBC in the tank, it feels like often for the Democrats, is these guys are desperately chasing eyeballs so they get advertising revenue in an era when it's harder and harder to get advertising revenue. How much do you think is just the business model has been eviscerated because it was a pre-internet business model, and how much do you think is the human dynamic that you were describing already on this discussion, and you do such a great job with in the book?
I think it's a huge one, and it's one of the reasons why I think that while Donald Trump can exacerbate some problems, it would exist without it. And it's one of the problems that I lay out in the book is called broken financial incentive structure.
Yep.
And the business is broken. It's no longer, it exists anymore. And there are several kind of offshoots of what happens when we're in that environment. One of them is that I think that there has been a very real recognition by places like the New York Times or CNN, and certainly from I've been amazed by some of these more legacy media outlets, like ABC News and CBS News, of the fact that you once try to have this Big Ten. You once try to who's your audience? Well, it's everyone. They no longer even think that, because it's obviously not true. So there is this sense, I think, in a lot of these places, and I've had conversations with them, where not necessarily that they have to just hang on to the lowest hanging fruit and hang on for dear life, but when you make kind of editorial choices, you need to make sure you're not going to alienate the base. Yeah, okay, we want a lot of people, but we need to make sure we're not going to turn off our core audience. And the more I say this, the more I think of on the right as well. Certainly with Fox News, look at like what happened after 2020. So it leads to sort of editorial decision making that is not purely based on what's the most important story, how can we tell a full picture. It is a little bit of audience capture in a lot of ways, that the kind of audience capture that we see, frankly, with people that make a living now on Substack. When you like literally know, okay, this is my audience. It does a lot if you're going to tell people that want to unsubscribe if you start to publish things in a certain way. Same thing is happening in these large newsrooms as well. And so I do think that kind of that broken structure is one element of it. Another one relates more to social media, but these, I almost use the term kids. I turned 40 last month, so I can
Happy
say like these
birthday.
kids now. um, but younger staffers at these places, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you know, they're growing audiences that, maybe they have more followers on TikTok than their organization does. Well, what does that mean? It certainly means that and I've heard it described, I've seen an article about this where they think of themselves as more like, recording artists. And these companies like the Washington Post as a record company, a record label. Yeah, they put out my album, maybe they put out a couple of them, but this is not where I live. I don't have any real attachment, or I'm not part of this large organization. Now we're working together. It's mutually beneficial. Maybe I'll go on to my own thing. Maybe I'll go to the next one. When you have that, you you no longer have this institutional heft that you once had at these larger news organizations, and that can lead to massive problems both internally and externally. And that one's not getting solved. I think that we can start to say, all right, let's start to not get so captured by our audience. Let's hold firm with our principles. But the business model is not changing. And I do think the other big thing about this, we saw this, like CNN Plus came out and came and went. These companies have, even when I was there, we were thinking about, okay, what does streaming look like? What does CNN look like on Facebook? But no one really thought that it would change in such a significant way. I mean, I talk to people like, this is the Megyn Kelly show, for example, right? I mean, the Megyn Kelly show, I talked to people recently who say, "Oh, I love the Megyn Kelly show. I watch it on Instagram Reels." It's like, well, that 1 minute you're watching, like, we do like an actual show. It's an hour and a half long, but that's how people think of it all of it. I mean, New York Times, people think of New York Times as Wordle and the crossword puzzle. I mean, when you have that, it can be a problem. So you have big organizations that don't really know how to stay big and are frankly getting smaller. And you have these upstart independent outlets that are really appealing to especially a younger demographic in journalism. So I think that for a lot of reasons that the business model is a huge factor in this.
Yeah, and I want to. I don't know that you know how to fix it or I know how to fix it. I love your thoughts on that, but I also want a sense of well. So let's turn to that. The media is broken. How do you fix it?
uh, okay. Well, in the last chapter, I do lay out some ideas. It's going to take a lot, and I don't think that it's going to happen overnight. But here are a few that I lay out and uncovered. Uh, I've been I've always been a fan of ombudsmen, or public editors. The New York Times used to have one, very active. Margaret Sullivan was a great one back before she kind of went a little crazy during the Trump era. I even think of people like Eric Wemple at the Washington Post, who's interviewed in the book, David Folkenflik at NPR, who I interview in the book, who I think do great jobs at their organizations and who kind of serve that role. They cover other things in the media, but when something happens at the Washington Post, Eric Wemple is going to write about it. And I think you can respect that a lot. And I frankly think that if people are empowered, if journalists are empowered to be at an organization and to be that check on them, I I think that can go a long way. So that's one. Certainly, we talk about geographic bias, and I think that we've seen with the pandemic, and it's been a side effect of what's happened with COVID. But more and more people that left these newsrooms after they basically shut down in New York and DC, they've never come back. I have friends who work at NBC News who live in Florida. I have friends who are at Fox who are in Nashville. They're now out of these power centers, the Acela media power centers, and I think that's a good thing. Just by being outside of these places, that will be good. And frankly, now the next generation can be people you hire who are from these areas who can just stay there. And they don't even necessarily have to go and cover what's happening in these places, to just be a different kind of person who doesn't have to move to New York or DC, who's interested in journalism. And I think that can go a long way.
All
And
right.
then,
Oh, sorry, please.
yeah, go ahead.
No, you were on a roll, and I mistook a pause for finish with the recommendations you got.
All right, one more. I think that when you have people that are in these places, let's say you hire someone of college who doesn't want to move to New York or DC. They say, "Oh, you can stay, where you are in South Dakota, or you can come to DC." They say, "Oh, no, I'd love to stay here." these are people, and I've met them. They are hopefully, and I actually think Gen Z is better than millennials on this. They don't necessarily have this deep urge to become a quote unquote influencer, to become a star. When you hire journalists that don't have this personal desire to be famous, that will also go a long way.
All right. So a lot of in the media, certainly the whole time I've paid attention, they would always talk about separating church and state, by which they mean the business and the advertisers from the substance. But a question in my mind, and I think I've seen it once or twice now in the chat here, is there a different church and state we need to think about separating, specifically news and opinion? I mean, one reason people may think the New York Times is biased is because they endorse presidential candidates and other candidates every election, as newspapers have been doing for hundreds of years. Likewise, Fox News, MSNBC are 85% opinion shows, and 10 to 15% what would be the traditional NBC, Peter Jennings kind of, evening news. I wonder how much, I'm interested in your take, how much is the brand confusion of what labels itself news is fundamentally opinion and only marginally news?
Yeah, it's it's one of the reasons why I write a little bit about MSNBC in my book, but MSNBC I have respect for because they are honest about themselves. They are I believe the last time I looked, they don't really consider any of their hours as quote unquote news programming. I mean, there are certainly hours that are more newsy and more that are opinion, but what's always bothered me more about places like CNN and frankly other outlets like the Washington Post or the New York Times is that there is there is the line. I actually think that part of the problem is when you draw a line between news and opinion, but you draw it in an incorrect way, when you're not honest either with your audience or you're not honest with yourself about who you are. It was amazing to me that during the Trump era, Chris Cuomo's show on CNN and Don Lemon's show on CNN were news shows. And they were explicit about it. I mean, when I like it's and again, I like Don and I used to have a good relationship with Chris. I they do fine shows. I have a friend here in Dallas who I say who said he watches Don Lemon every night. This was like in 2018. I was like, oh, what do you like about it? He's like, it makes me laugh. It's funny. I was like, okay, that's fine. No one's watching that show because they want to just sit down and find out what the news is that day. He's an entertainer. Maybe you like him, maybe you don't, but it's not a news show. And I think that's the problem. I think that if we have a media apparatus that's essentially honest about who they are, about what they bring to the table, about their biases, I have opinions. I try to also be fair and honest and truthful about what I'm putting out there. I'm making editorial choices every day about what I cover and what I don't cover. I wrote a column this week for The Hill. Next week, I'll write another column. There will be things I don't write about. Those are all editorial choices. So I think that the problem is when you have this sort of old school capital J journalism veneer, this veil of objectivity, when it's not really what the business model is anymore. And that's not what the editorial product is. And I think the audience knows that. So I think the audience would appreciate honesty more so than a kind of separation between news and opinion in that way.
Yeah, I'm going to have Stephen Brill. I don't think Gordon Krovitz is going to come on too with NewsGuard. One of the things that I like about their effort and their product is just the simple labeling of accuracy and consistency as opposed to it's an opinion show. And to your point, you appreciate just, I know who you are, I know who you're trying to be, so I know what to expect, and I don't misperceive it as something that it's not. Let me ask you this, hopefully there are some younger folks who are or will watch this who are up and coming in journalism. What do you think a journalist's obligation is to report on something when they believe it's both false and dangerous? So Holocaust denialism or not vaccinating kids against, say, measles, where that's proven safe and effective and has saved lives. What some people got in trouble, particularly in COVID, for stridently suggesting this is the truth and the only acceptable truth. But at the same time, truth is a thing. I'm not one of these who takes kind of the Ivy League presidents. Well, I've got my truth. Like that's alternative
Right.
facts as far as I'm concerned. So
Yeah.
what's your advice to journalists who are trying to say, look, I'm trying to call balls and strikes here?
Yeah, and I think that that's a very valid and that should be a goal. I think that you should tell the truth. And the problem though is what happened with a lot of these things that you've mentioned. It starts to delve into a territory of what I have dubbed in the book anti-speech activism. And it's one thing to say this is untrue. This is false. This is a lie. Call it what you want. And I know people have said, oh, Trump lies, but if you say he's not telling the truth, it's not hard enough. And so you got to say he's lying about this. Fine, pick whatever you want to say. The problem I see is when tech companies and when government organizations, and frankly, what we saw like with the Hunter Biden laptop story, which is the first thing I write about in the book, with corporate media organizations work together, essentially in collusion, to shut down conversation, to shut down points of view, and to, in the case of the Hunter Biden laptop story, an actual, something that wasn't false. But I think that's really where it gets dangerous. And I've seen the rise of this from people that are ostensibly media reporters or even like the fact-checking community to say this is false. So we need to make sure people don't see it. And I think that's when you start to get into very dangerous territory. And frankly, I think it actually does a disservice to journalists themselves, because I think the best way to prove out to show America what is a true, what's true, what's false, is to show what is maybe bubbling up and make the case to report it out, show why this is false. Frankly, I think one of the things that I point to with the Megyn Kelly show, we launched in September 2020. I don't think it's any secret that we have an audience that leans right, and I don't think there were a lot of outlets out there that looked at pretty much all of like the Trump legal challenges in November and December into January, and with an open mind. And so, all right, well, what's exactly is challenging? We had everyone on from Dinesh D'Souza right on down the line and kept an open mind about it. And in the end, Megyn and all of us, we have a pretty large producing team, determined that those were not accurate. That you have to just we looked at it, and then this is what we've come to the conclusion about. But and so in that way, and there were certainly audience members that disagree with us or were not happy about it, but that does a lot more than simply saying this is not only not true, we need to make sure you don't ever see this again. And I think that's where the lane that a lot of these organizations go down that really kind of backfires.
Yeah, I see your point, of course, on the straight up blocking. Although what's so difficult is I tend to think the Steele dossier, which was technically foreign disinformation, got too much airtime. And so the effort on the Hunter Biden laptop, there, I suspect, were many folks who said this looks like, smells like, and acts like foreign disinformation. Neither the Russians nor the Chinese nor other hostile foreign powers ought to be influencing our election by putting stuff out there. It turned out it was true. So suppressing it is debatably even worse. But if I were in an editorial newsroom and somebody said all the experts that we talk to say this has really got to be foreign disinformation, I'd lean pretty hard on, well, we better not amplify. We need to, same without your op-ed on Avenatti. I mean, that guy got a ludicrous amount of TV time for
Yeah.
being the clown that he was.
Yeah. Well, listen, that's actually a really interesting kind of nuanced editorial, like ethical conversation. Like, I just saw the Steele dossier as an example. I look at what happened with that, and I write a little bit about it in the book. Jake Tapper and others at CNN reported that on the existence of the dossier and the fact that the president himself, Donald Trump, was briefed on it by James Comey, and that's a pretty enormous moment there. And then BuzzFeed drops the literal Steele dossier just without any editorializing to it at all. It's like, hey, we're WikiLeaks now. Here's the actual full thing. And then, of course, it just starts spiraling, and we start to go, oh, and and MSNBC is basically treating it like it's gospel. I'm not so sure CNN made a mistake in writing that initial story. I actually think that there is a news value to saying, look at this. This is an incredible moment, and it was true. He did get briefed on it. But then you have to contextualize it, and you have to kind of say, it's gonna take a little bit to figure out whether there's any accuracy to this at all. And it's a story in and of itself, if it's complete BS, and so I'm on the kind of more information, not less. Get it all out there. If it's true, get it out there, but put it into context and take your time with it.
All right, last question. You've been generous with your time, Stephen. We appreciate it. What do you take with my following argument that is debatably very contrary to your core thesis, which is, what if we're actually in a golden age of journalism and media? What if publications like Substack enable an entire new type of muckraker, you and Megyn doing your little show, and that what's happening is the internet we are in the process of seeing 20th century pre-internet media and the institutions that they built getting blown up, and that some of the mistrust is the effort by businesses whose business models were destroyed to still try to hold on to things, but that depending upon how you choose to define media, we're actually in an amazing golden age of, I mean, I love Noah Smith. I love Matt Iglesias. You guys, I feel like I'm getting, my media diet is broader, more diverse, and more balanced than it's ever been, with the arguable exception of local. Um, so I sometimes wonder whether everything you describe is right and true, but is the media broken, or is the media reinventing itself?
Yeah, look, I think as critical as I am of the press, I'm optimistic also. I'm pretty glass half full about where things are like you are. One of the solutions I try to lay out at the end of the book is that I think we need a little bit more partnership between the independent media side and the corporate media side. Um, one of Rich McHugh is someone who worked at NBC, is someone I interviewed for the book, and was working with Ronan Farrow on the Weinstein story that got killed. He's now at News Nation, but in between, he was at Substack, and Rich works on stories that you're going to get sued about, right? I mean, you need to know that you have the resources behind you, the money, the legal backing to do the kind of journalism that takes a lot to get done. So the only way you're going to get that is with some corporate institutional media also. At the same time, I look at someone like a Glenn Greenwald, and it pains me to see that the kind of the breakup that happened between Glenn Greenwald and MSNBC when he was on there every week. Chris Hayes' show and Rachel Maddow, I think they could really benefit a lot from each other. I think that MSNBC audience should hear from Glenn. Glenn's of the left. He happens to disagree on certain things, or he's critical, or I would say he's essentially ideologically consistent in ways that maybe they aren't. But I think you need more partnership in these ways. And so it's all a long way of saying that I agree with you. I think that there are more media outlets than ever. I actually think that more people in the corporate media, this may be an unpopular opinion with some people, but I'm a big fan of Chris Licht. I actually like what he was doing at CNN until, for various other reasons, there was kind of like internal uprising that happened, and some other factors. We had some of these profiles that got out there. We could spend all day
Got
on
out
that.
there. He invited Tim to follow him. I mean, dude, it's self-destruction.
Yes, and that ended up being kind of the final nail in the coffin for sure of that. This was the Atlantic piece that was written almost a year ago now that led to his exit. But when you put, he was empowered to put just small changes there. I mean, we're talking about things like, instead of calling election lies the big lie, which is a political term, let's just call it election lies. Okay, that's a small thing. Instead of saying the "don't say gay" bill in Florida, let's just call it what it's actually called. Like, these are small things that actually make meaningful difference to an audience when they're watching, and they start to, they're not tells that you're not objective. So I think that there's more and more people that are aware of the blind spots. And so I agree with you. I think that, with the caveat that as long as Donald Trump is on the spotlight, that we are not going to get a lot of fix. Eventually, that will not be the case, and I think that we're going to be in a place where there's going to be some positive direction, both on the independent side and on the corporate side.
Steve Krakauer, the book is Uncovered. It's terrific. We appreciate your making time for us, and to carry on with the great show you and Megan are doing.
Hey guys, thanks so much. I really appreciate it.